The training roster listed her as H7741. Not a name, a species designation code, the same code that appeared on every human intake form processed by the Valith, Combined Military Academy's Administrative Division, printed in the same font as the 312 other species designations that appeared on the first-year roster of the Academy's 42nd cohort. H7741 in the fourth row, between a Velthun designation and a Theresi designation, indistinguishable from any other code on any other line of any other roster that the Academy had processed in its 60-year history. The name attached to the code was Recruit Amara Solano. She was 19 years old. She was from Earth. She was the first human to be accepted to the Valith Combined Military Academy, which was either the most significant thing about her or the fourth or fifth most significant thing about her, depending on who was doing the assessment and how much of her file they had read before they formed the opinion. Sergeant Dreven Veth had read none of her file before the cohort's first morning. This was not unusual. Sergeant Veth did not read recruit files before first contact. He had been running first-year cohorts at the Academy for 11 years, and he had formed the opinion, early in those 11 years and confirmed by every year since, that reading recruit files before first contact contaminated the assessment. Files told you what the recruit had done. First contact told you what the recruit was. Those were different things, and the second one was the one that mattered for what Sergeant Veth did, which was take whatever the cohort was on the first morning and make it into something that could survive what the Academy was going to put it through. The first morning was always the same. Not the schedule, not the specific activities, the quality. Every first morning of every cohort in 11 years had the same quality, which was the quality of 312 beings who had come from wherever they came from with whatever they had been told about what this was going to be like, assembled in the main training yard before sunrise, and who were about to find out that what they had been told was insufficient. Sergeant Veth walked out of the building at 500 and looked at the cohort. He looked at them the way he looked at every cohort on the first morning, which was the look that his 11 years had made into something specific. Not the look that assessed capability, which would come later. The look that assessed the thing underneath capability, the thing that capability was built on, the thing that either was there or was not, and that training could strengthen but could not create from nothing. He looked at them. He found what he usually found, which was a mix. Some who had it, some who did not. Most who were somewhere in the space between not having it and having it. That was where most recruits started and where the Academy's job began. He looked at H7741 in the fourth row. Amara Solano was not tall. This was not the first thing he noticed about her, but it was a thing he noticed because height was a variable that the Academy's physical training was calibrated around, and the calibration assumed a certain range, and she was at the low end of that range in a way that his eye noted and filed. She was standing in the formation with the stillness of someone who had been standing in formations before, not the stillness of someone trying to look like they had been in formations before, which was the stillness of someone thinking about standing still, but the real kind, the kind that came from the body knowing what formation stillness felt like and doing it without the brain needing to be involved. He noted that. He began. He said, "In the next 12 months, this Academy is going to find out which of you can do what needs to be done when what needs to be done is the thing you least want to do. It is going to find out by making you do it, not simulations of it, not approximations. The thing itself, in conditions as close to the actual thing as the Academy can produce without the actual thing being present." He looked at the cohort. He said, "Some of you will not finish the year. This is not a threat. It is a statistic. It is based on 11 years of cohorts, and the statistic has not changed significantly because what the Academy requires has not changed, and what beings bring to it does not change significantly from year to year. You will leave because you decide to leave or because the academy decides for you. Either way, the result is the same, and neither result is a failure of character. The academy is not for everyone. It is for the ones it is for. He paused. He said, I am Sergeant Dreven Veth. I will be your primary instructor for the first year. This is what that means. It means that the gap between what you are now and what the academy needs you to become is my problem to close. I have been closing that gap for 11 years. I am good at it. Whether you are good at it is what we are here to find out. He said, the morning begins now. It began. The first thing the morning produced was a run. Not a run in the sense of the academy's standard physical assessment, a controlled distance at a controlled pace with controlled measurement. A run in the sense that Sergeant Veth pointed at the terrain ahead of the main training yard, which was the academy's outer training grounds, 12 kilometers of terrain that the academy had specifically selected for its variety and difficulty, and that had been selected when the academy was built 60 years ago by people who understood that terrain was itself a teacher and said, to the marker and back, no assistance, no stopping, keep up with the group or find your own way back. 312 recruits moved into the terrain. The terrain did what terrain that had been selected for variety and difficulty did, which was that it was various and difficult. In the first kilometer it was flat and fast, and produced the sensation in recruits who were used to flat and fast that the run was going to be manageable. In the second kilometer the flat ended and the gradient began, and the gradient was sustained for 3 kilometers before the terrain changed again. In the 5th kilometer there was water, a crossing that was neither shallow enough to walk through dry nor deep enough to require swimming. The specific depth that was the worst depth because it was wet without being committed. In the 6th kilometer, the terrain did something that the Academy Selection Committee had specifically prized, which was that it became unpredictable in a way that the recruits could not adapt to because unpredictability that could be adapted to was just a more complex pattern, and the Academy was not interested in patterns. The 6th kilometer was the kind of terrain that required constant reading and constant adjustment. That had no correct approach because the correct approach changed with each step. That rewarded the recruits who were processing it continuously over the recruits who were processing it in chunks. Sergeant Veth ran with the cohort, not in front, not at a pace that set the tone. At the pace that let him see the whole cohort, that let him watch what the terrain produced in 312 beings, that let him read the thing underneath the capability. He watched. He found what he usually found in the first kilometer. The recruits who had trained specifically for this and who were running the training they had done. The recruits who had not trained specifically for this and who were running what their species biology gave them. The recruits in the space between the two who were processing the gap between what they had expected and what was happening, and who were doing different things with that gap depending on what they were. He watched the 4th row. Amara Solano ran. She did not run the way that most recruits ran the first kilometer, which was the way that their preparation had trained them or their biology had made them. She ran the way that Sergeant Veth, watching, spent 300 meters trying to categorize before he stopped trying to categorize it and just watched it. She ran like she was reading the terrain ahead of where she was, not reacting to the terrain as it arrived, but anticipating it from the information available before it arrived, looking at the slope ahead and adjusting her stride before she reached the slope, looking at the surface change ahead and shifting her foot position before she stepped on the surface change, running the terrain 2 steps ahead of her current step. He had seen recruits with good terrain reading. He had seen recruits who had trained specifically in terrain reading and who were very good at it. He had not seen a 19-year-old running the terrain 2 steps ahead of herself, as though the 2 steps ahead were already the terrain she was on. He watched her through the first kilometer. He watched her through the gradient. He watched what the gradient produced in the cohort, which was the first real selection event of the morning, because gradients were honest in a way that flat terrain was not. because gradients applied a constant force that the body could compensate for up to a point, and could not compensate for past that point, and the point was different for different beings, and the gradient showed where the points were. Amara Solano's gradient did not show a point. She went up the gradient at the same pace she had run the flat. This was not possible in the mechanical sense. The gradient was the gradient, and gradients required more effort than flat terrain, and more effort produced lower speed or higher cost or both. It was not possible to run a gradient at the same pace as flat terrain without the cost appearing somewhere. The cost was not appearing anywhere that Sergeant Veth could see. He ran up the gradient and watched her run up the gradient and tried to find where the cost was going and could not find it and kept watching. At the water crossing in the 5th kilometer, he found something. She entered the water without changing her pace. Not the gradual pace reduction that every other recruit produced as they encountered the water and assessed it, and committed to a crossing depth and adjusted. She entered the water at the pace she had been running, and she ran through the water at that pace, and she exited the water at that pace. The water was the specific depth that was wet without being committed. She went through it as though she had decided before she reached it that being wet was a condition that was not relevant to the pace, and had implemented that decision and kept running. He filed it. In the 6th kilometer, in the unpredictable terrain, he watched the cohort process the unpredictability. He watched the recruits who were good at reading terrain struggle with terrain that could not be read in advance. He watched the recruits who had specific physical advantages that the other terrain had not been able to express find that unpredictable terrain was where the advantages expressed. He watched the full range of what 312 beings brought to the specific problem of terrain that required constant adjustment. Amara Solano ran the 6th kilometer like she had run the 1st. She ran it 2 steps ahead. Not because she was better at reading the terrain than beings who had trained for terrain reading, because she was not reading the terrain the way beings read terrain when they were reading terrain. She was reading it the way something read it when reading was not a process applied to the terrain, but a condition of moving through it, when the information of the terrain was not processed as data to be analyzed, but absorbed as something that was already part of the running. Sergeant Veth had been running training cohorts for 11 years. He had not seen that before. He filed it. The cohort returned from the run in the order that the run produced, which was not the same order it had left in. Sergeant Veth watched them come in. He counted the ones who came in together in the front group, and the ones who came in the middle, and the ones who came in at the back, and the ones who had needed assistance finding their way back from the 6th kilometer's unpredictable terrain. Amara Solano came in with the front group. Not at the front of the front group. In it. She came in alongside 3 Drakvari recruits who were the largest beings in the cohort and who had physical advantages that the run had rewarded, and alongside a Velthun recruit who had clearly trained specifically for this, and who was the most technically prepared recruit in the cohort's front group. She came in with them, not near them, with them, at their pace, at the end of a run that had included a gradient and a water crossing and 6 kilometers of terrain that required constant adjustment. She came in and stopped and stood in the recovery position that the Academy's intake materials had specified, and she was breathing hard. The breathing was the first indication that the run had cost something. She was breathing hard in the specific way that maximum sustainable effort produced when the effort was over, the deep regular breathing of a respiratory system that had been running at its limit and was now recovering, not the gasped breathing of a system that had been past its limit. She had been at the limit for 12 kilometers. At the limit and not past it. For 12 kilometers. Sergeant Veth looked at her for a moment. Then he moved on because the morning was not finished. The morning was not finished for 6 more hours. The 6 hours included a tactical assessment exercise in which the cohort was divided into units and given an objective and given conditions that made the objective difficult and told to complete the objective, an exercise that was not the Academy's actual tactical assessment, which came later in the year, but an exercise designed to produce information about how the recruits processed difficulty when the difficulty was tactical rather than physical. Amara Salana's unit was assigned the objective of clearing a simulated structure while working with 4 other recruits of different species who had different physical capabilities and who had not worked together before. The simulation used the Academy's training structure, which was built to be reconfigurable, and which had been configured for this exercise in a specific way that Sergeant Vuth had been configuring for 11 years. He watched the unit. He watched what the unit produced. He watched Amara Salana in the unit. She did not lead. This was the first thing he noted because the recruits who had leadership tendencies typically expressed them immediately in first contact unit situations, and leadership expression in first contact situations before the unit had established any basis for authority was one of the things the exercise was designed to evaluate. She did not lead. She moved to the position in the unit that gave her the best observation of the whole unit's situation, and she started contributing information from that position, information about the structure's geometry and the simulated opposing forces position, and the unit's own position relative to both. The information was accurate, consistently accurate in the way that information was consistently accurate when it was not being processed through interpretation, but was being directly read from the environment. The unit used the information. The unit completed the objective. Sergeant Vuth noted the time. The time was the fastest the exercise had been completed in 11 years. He did not announce this. He moved to the next element of the morning. The next element was what the Academy called the stress position, which was a poor name for what it was, which was not a position but a sustained condition. The cohort was placed in the training yard in full kit and told to maintain stillness for an indeterminate period. The indeterminate period was the element. Recruits who were told to maintain stillness for a specified period could organize themselves around the specified period. Recruits who were told to maintain stillness for an indeterminate period could not organize themselves because there was no structure to organize around. The indeterminate period produced, in recruits who were not able to tolerate indeterminacy, visible distress that expressed itself in small movements, in shifting weight, in the micro-expressions that Sergeant Vuth had been reading for 11 years, and that told him what he needed to know. He walked through the cohort. He read. He reached the 4th row. Amara Salana was in stillness. Not the stillness of someone maintaining stillness. The stillness of someone who was comfortable in stillness, who was not maintaining it, who was simply in it. He looked at her for a moment. He said loudly enough for the cohort to hear, "Recruit Salana." She said, "Sergeant." He said, "This is just training. You understand that?" She said, "Yes, Sergeant." He said, "Nothing here is real. The run was not real. The structure was not real. This is simulated difficulty for the purpose of assessment." She said, "Yes, Sergeant." He said, "How does that feel?" She looked at him. The cohort was watching because the cohort was in stillness with nothing to do except watch. She said, "It feels like training, Sergeant." He said, "You understand the difference between training and the actual thing?" She said, "Yes, Sergeant." He said, "What is the difference?" She looked at him steadily. She said, "In the actual thing the consequences are real." He said, "Correct. In training the consequences are simulated. In the actual thing the consequences are real. This is training. You are safe here." She said, "Yes, Sergeant." He said, "Does that change anything for you?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "No, Sergeant." He said, "Explain." She said, "The way I run the terrain is the way I run the terrain. The way I move through a structure is the way I move through a structure. The consequences being simulated does not change the way I do those things, because the way I do those things is not a response to the consequences. He looked at her. He said, "What is it a response to?" She said, "The terrain, the structure, the situation, the actual thing in front of me." He said, "Not the consequences." She said, "The consequences are what happens after. I do not run the terrain after. I run it now. Now is the same whether the consequences are simulated or real." The cohort was very still. Not the maintained stillness of the stress position, the stillness of beings who were listening to something. Sergeant Vuth looked at Amira Selena for a long moment. He said, "Where did you learn that?" She said, "Earth, Sergeant." He said specifically. She looked at him. She said, "Everywhere on Earth, Sergeant. It is what Earth produces." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he walked back to the front of the cohort. He had 11 years of reading recruits. He had read thousands. He had found things in those thousands that he had noted and filed, and that had in some cases changed what he understood about what the Academy was producing and what it was possible to produce. He had not found this. Not this specific quality. Not the thing she had described, the running of the terrain without the consequences as the organizer, the now as the constant without the after as the variable that changed the now. Not in 19 years on a species that had been doing it for 11,000 years. He filed it in the part of his assessment that he kept for the things that did not fit the existing categories. The afternoon produced more elements. Each element produced information. Each piece of information went into the same file. By the end of the first day, Sergeant Vuth had a picture of the 42nd cohort that his 11 years told him was the clearest first-day picture he had produced. Not because the cohort was exceptional, though it had exceptional elements, but because the picture included something that gave him a reference point he had not had before. He wrote his first-day assessment report that evening. The report went through the cohort in the order the roster listed them. When he reached H7741, he wrote for longer than he had written for any other recruit in 11 years of first-day assessment reports. He wrote, "Recruit Salana Amara, Human Earth, First-Day Assessment. The standard assessment categories are insufficient for accurate description. I will use them and note where they are insufficient. Physical, significantly above cohort average across all measured variables. The specific nature of the above-average performance requires elaboration. The performance is not the product of specific athletic training, which produces a recognizable pattern of advantage in trained areas and normal performance in untrained areas. The performance pattern is uniform across all variables, including variables that specific athletic training does not typically address. The uniformity suggests a developmental baseline rather than a training product. The gradient performance and water crossing performance particularly support this interpretation. This recruit ran the gradient at flat terrain pace and showed no behavioral adjustment to the water crossing. These are not trained responses. Trained responses show the training. These do not show training. They show something else. Tactical. The structure exercise produced the fastest completion in cohort history for this exercise. Recruit Salana's contribution to the unit was information provision rather than leadership, which is the correct role for first contact unit situations where leadership authority has not been established. The accuracy and rate of the information provision was outside the normal parameters for a recruit at this stage of development. The information appeared to be directly read rather than processed through analysis. I do not have a framework for this. Psychological. The stress position produced no measurable distress indicators. When questioned about the simulated nature of the training environment, Recruit Salana stated that the simulated consequences do not change the way she engages with the actual thing in front of her. She described running the terrain in the now without the after as the organizing variable. This is the most significant single observation from the first day. I have been looking for this quality in recruits for 11 years because it is the quality that underlies everything else the Academy is trying to produce. I have found approximations of it. I have not found it as a baseline. Recruit Saluna presents it as a baseline. He stopped writing for a moment. He added, I want to note for the record that I asked this recruit where she learned this, and she said Earth. She said everywhere on Earth. She said it is what Earth produces. I am going to spend some time thinking about what it means that a planet produces this as a baseline output rather than as a rare exceptional development. He completed the report. He filed it. He sat in his office and thought about the cohort and the day, and the picture the day had produced. He thought about the run and the gradient and the water crossing and the structure exercise and the stress position and the exchange about training and the actual thing. He thought about the consequences are what happens after. I do not run the terrain after. I run it now. Now is the same whether the consequences are simulated or real. He had been trying to teach recruits that for 11 years. He had been trying to teach it because it was the thing that made the difference in the actual thing, the thing that the Academy was ultimately preparing recruits for, the thing that all the training was trying to produce. He had been trying to teach it for 11 years. She had arrived with it. He thought about what that meant. He thought about Earth, about what Earth was and what Earth produced and what 11,000 years of Earth had built in the people who came from it. He thought about a 19-year-old in the fourth row who ran the terrain 2 steps ahead and went through the water without adjusting and completed the structure exercise faster than anyone in cohort history, and stood in stillness without maintaining it, and said the now is the same whether the consequences are real or simulated. He thought about what it meant to spend 11 years trying to produce a thing and encounter a species that had it as a baseline. He thought about what it meant for the next 11 months. He thought it meant the next 11 months were going to be unlike any previous 11 months. He was right. But that was not the most interesting thing he was right about. The most interesting thing he was right about was what he had filed under the part of his assessment that he kept for the things that did not fit the existing categories. He had filed it as, the now is not a training product, it is a civilization product. He thought about that for a long time. Then he wrote one more thing in his personal notes that was not the assessment report and was not filed with the Academy. He wrote, I have been trying to teach recruits how to be in the actual thing. I have been starting from training and trying to get to the actual thing. She starts from the actual thing. Earth starts from the actual thing. They have been in the actual thing for 11,000 years, and it is what they produce as baseline. I have been teaching toward where they begin. He looked at what he had written. He wrote one more line. He wrote, I think I have been teaching the wrong direction. He closed the notes. Outside his office window, the Academy's training grounds were dark and quiet. 312 recruits were in their quarters after the first day of what was going to be 11 months. In the fourth row of the formation the next morning, there would be H7741 again. Now the same as any other now. Which was the whole thing. Which had always been the whole thing.